A 58-year-old former carpenter stood in line outside a bank for 7 hours in a January freeze to apply for a small business loan. The branch manager watched him from inside the building the entire time. She brought coffee to her staff twice. She never opened the door. He didn't know she was watching. He didn't know the loan officer who would review his file was her direct report. He didn't know that by the time he reached the front desk, soaking in cold that had settled into the joints of both hands, he would force her to confront something she had been avoiding for 11 years. And neither of them would walk out of that building the same way they walked in. Harold Kwame Asante had not spent 30 years swinging a hammer because it was easy. He had done it because it was the one thing in this world that told the truth. Wood either held or it didn't. A joint either fit or it didn't. There was no resume, no credential, no reference letter that could fake a dovetail cut made by someone who didn't know what they were doing. He had built that understanding in his hands before he built anything else, starting at 17 in the workshop behind his uncle's house in Hamilton, Ontario, cutting himself 3 times in the first week and learning more from those 3 cuts than from any classroom he had ever sat in. He was 58 now. His hands showed it, knuckles thickened by years of grip and cold and pressure, a scar running along the base of his left thumb from a chisel that slipped in 2003, calluses layered so deep they had become part of his fingerprints. But his back was the real problem. 2 herniated discs, one in the lumbar, one above it, diagnosed in the fall after a beam shifted on a renovation site in Brantford, and he caught it wrong. His doctor said he could return to light work in 4 to 6 months. His body said something different. The pain came in waves that started in his lower back and moved down through his left leg like something being wrung out of him. He couldn't swing a hammer anymore. Not like that. Not for 8 hours on a job site in February with no accommodation. So Harold had made a decision. He was going to build furniture, custom, handcrafted, the kind that people pass down instead of replacing. He had the skills. He had the tools. Most of them, the ones that hadn't been sold off during the 18 months he couldn't work. He had a garage with insulation he had installed himself and a workbench that was older than his daughter. What he didn't have was capital, a proper table saw, a planer that wasn't missing a blade guard, a lathe, a band saw, a finishing setup that didn't involve a single bulb hanging from a wire. And inventory. Wood cost money before it became furniture. He needed $14,000. He had applied to 2 banks already. Both had declined within a week. The letters were polite and they said the same thing in different orders. Insufficient credit history for a sole proprietorship. No demonstrable revenue in the proposed business category. Elevated risk profile given the applicant's recent employment gap. The employment gap. As if the 18 months he had spent in physiotherapy and pain management and lying on the floor of his kitchen at 3 in the morning, because it was the only position that didn't make him want to scream, was a character flaw. As if the fact that his body had been broken doing work that built other people's homes was a reason to deny him the chance to rebuild on his own terms. He found out about the Pemberton Credit Union on Concession Street through a woman at his physiotherapy clinic who had gotten a small business loan for her alteration shop 2 years earlier. Community-based, she said. They still talk to you like a person. The appointment was for 9 in the morning on a Thursday in January. Harold left his house at 7:15. The bus from his neighborhood took 40 minutes on a good day. He gave himself extra time because January in Hamilton did not offer good days as a default. The bus was 20 minutes late. By the time Harold reached the credit union on Concession Street, it was 8:57 and the doors were locked. He stood on the sidewalk and read the sign twice. Due to a water main issue affecting the building's plumbing, in-person service would be suspended until 10 o'clock. Please call to reschedule or wait. We apologize for the inconvenience. Harold checked his phone. His loan appointment confirmation email said, the file review was time-sensitive. Applications in this intake period would close at the end of the business day. Rescheduling could mean waiting 6 weeks for the next intake window. 6 weeks was February, possibly March. He had orders he could take if he had the equipment. A dining table from a couple in Dundas, a set of chairs from a man he knew from church who was renovating his rec room. Not guaranteed money, but real conversations, real interest. The kind that went cold if you asked someone to wait 6 weeks. He stood outside the credit union at 8:58 in the morning on a Thursday in January and made the only decision available to him. He would wait. The temperature was -14 with wind chill coming off the escarpment. Harold was wearing a canvas work jacket, the heavy one he used on outdoor job sites, and thermal underlayers and the kind of wool socks his daughter mocked every Christmas when she bought him a new pair. He had his file in a manila envelope tucked inside a waterproof portfolio sleeve he had bought at Staples the night before specifically for this reason. His documents stayed dry. His face did not. By 9:30, the wind had found the gap between his collar and his jaw and was working on the rest of him methodically. Inside the credit union, on the second floor, Renata Okafor-Wells watched him through the glass. She was the branch manager, 44 years old, 12 years, with the credit union, the last 4 in this role. She had a meeting at 9:15 that ran long, a staffing issue with one of her lending advisors, and a coffee from the Tim Hortons on King Street that was still half full and already going cold. When she looked out her office window during a pause in the meeting, she saw the man on the sidewalk. He was standing very still, not pacing, not looking at his phone, not ducking into the alcove that offered approximately 8 centimeters of wind shelter near the door, just standing. Upright. Portfolio tucked under one arm, watching the door with the quiet patience of someone who had been waiting for things his entire life and had gotten very good at it. Renata watched him for a minute. Then she went back to her meeting. At 9:45, she looked again. Still there. She asked her assistant, Marcus, to bring the staff their second round of coffee from the break room. She did not say anything about the man outside. She was not a cruel woman. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was a precise woman, a careful woman, a woman who had built her career on the understanding that loan decisions had to be defensible, that extending credit to high-risk applicants without documented evidence of repayment capacity was not compassion, it was negligence. And the people who suffered most from negligent lending were not the institutions but the borrowers themselves, who ended up worse off than before. That was what she told herself. Harold did not know her name. He did not know there was anyone watching. He stood on the sidewalk on Concession Street with his file in a waterproof sleeve and counted the reasons he was still standing there and not walking back to the bus stop. The dining table. The man from church. His daughter Precious, who was 26 and studying nursing in Guelph, and who called every Sunday without fail, and who had never once in her life asked him for money, but who he knew was carrying a student loan that made him go quiet if he thought about it too long. The workbench his uncle had given him. The garage that was already insulated, already wired, already waiting, and something else. Harder to name, but not harder to feel. He had spent 30 years building things for other people. Additions, renovations, custom staircases, kitchen millwork, the occasional whole house from foundation up. He had built a sunroom for a man in Ancaster, who shook his hand once and then addressed every subsequent question to Harold's white foreman. He had built a deck for a woman in Stony Creek who complimented his English and then seemed genuinely startled when he told her he was born in Brampton. He had built and built and built, and he had done it well, and his back had given out before his work ethic did. And now he was standing on a sidewalk, in January, asked for the chance to build something for himself for the first time. He was not going to leave. At 10:10, the doors opened. A young man in a credit union vest held them wide and said, "Good morning, come on in, sorry for the wait." Harold walked through the doors and the warmth hit him in the face like something that had been owed to him for a long time. He found the men's room near the entrance and stood over the sink for a moment. His fingers were stiff. He ran warm water over them until they moved properly again. He looked at himself in the mirror. His face was red from the wind, and there were tear tracks on his cheeks from the cold, not from crying, just from what happens to eyes in January wind. But they were there. He blotted them with a paper towel. He straightened his collar. He picked up his portfolio. He walked to the loan desk and gave his name. 2 floors up, Renata Okafor-Wells was already reading his file. Her lending advisor, a man named Douglas, had flagged it that morning before the water issue. The appointment notes said, 58-year-old applicant, former construction tradesperson, injury-related career transition, sole proprietorship proposal, custom furniture, no demonstrable revenue in category, credit score 611, requesting $14,000. Douglas had written in the margin, in the shorthand Renata recognized from a decade of working with him. Probably a no. Renata had looked at that note before her meeting. She had looked at it again now. Then she walked downstairs. She did not normally sit in on preliminary loan appointments. That was not her role. Her role was review and sign-off, not intake. Douglas would conduct the appointment, collect additional documentation, and bring the file upstairs. She would look at the numbers and make a decision. But she had watched a man stand in -14 wind for over an hour with a file tucked under his arm. And something in that image had gotten into her the way cold got into joints, deep and hard to ignore. She sat in the chair beside Douglas's desk just before Harold was brought over. Douglas raised an eyebrow. She gave him the slight head shake that meant don't ask, I'll explain later. Harold Asante sat down across from them. He set his portfolio on the desk, opened it, and placed his documents in front of Douglas with the careful precision of a man who had organized them the night before and checked them twice in the morning. Resume, medical documentation from his specialist, 2 letters of reference from former clients, one a contractor he had worked under for 9 years, one the homeowner of a project in Waterdown, who had written 3 paragraphs about the quality of a custom built-in Harold had designed and installed in their library. Business plan, 12 pages, handwritten first, and then typed up at the public library on Barton Street, because Harold did not own a working printer. Projected materials cost, 3 preliminary client expressions of interest, printed email threads. Douglas went through each document the way he always did, methodically, without giving anything away. Then he looked up. Mr. Asante, your credit scores is sitting at 611. Our threshold for unsecured small business lending is typically 650, and the business has no operating history, which makes revenue projection difficult to substantiate. Harold's hands were flat on the table. He had placed them there deliberately. Mr. He glanced at the nameplate. Mr. Douglas. He paused. For 30 years, I poured everything I had into job sites. I showed up on time. I did good work. I didn't take shortcuts, and when my back gave out catching a beam that should have been properly rigged, I lost 18 months of income, which hit my credit, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I want to show you something. He reached into the portfolio and produced a single additional sheet. It was a photograph, printed at the library on regular paper, a little pale but clear. A staircase, curved white oak, with a wrought iron rail that flared slightly at the base like the bottom of a calligraphy stroke. I built that, he said, 7 years ago, 14-foot rise. Client changed the design 3 times. I made it work every time. That house sold last year for $2.1 million. He put the photograph back. I'm not asking you to believe I'll succeed, he said. I'm asking you to look at what I've already built and consider whether the number on a credit report is the whole story. The room was quiet. Douglas was writing something on his notepad. Short strokes. He had not said anything. Renata had not said anything either. She was looking at Harold's hands on the table, thick at the knuckles. A scar along the base of his left thumb. The hands of a man who had done real work for a long time. She thought, without entirely meaning to, about her father, who had driven a forklift for 22 years at a warehouse in Mississauga and had never once been offered a path to something better by the institution that cashed his paychecks every 2 weeks. She thought about the sidewalk. She thought about -14. Mr. Asante, she said. He looked at her, registering that she was not who he had expected to be sitting there. I'm Renata Okafor-Wells. I manage this branch. Harold nodded once. I have one question, she said. Why didn't you leave when you saw the doors were locked? Harold looked at her steadily. His hands did not move. Because the appointment was at 9, he said, and I wasn't late. Renata held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Douglas. Review the full file, she said. I'll want to see the complete assessment before end of day. She stood up, excused herself, and walked back upstairs. In her office, she stood at the window for a long moment. The sidewalk below was empty now. The wind was still moving the bare branches of the trees along Concession Street, back and forth, steady and indifferent. She picked up her phone and called her senior lending analyst. I'm sending you a file this afternoon, she said. I'd like a second opinion on the risk profile before I make a final call. There is something most people do not talk about when they talk about small business lending in Canada. The approval rates for new businesses with no operating history hover around 40% across major institutions. For applicants over 55, that rate drops by nearly a third, not because the regulations say so, but because of how risk is assessed and who is doing the assessing, and what assumptions they carry about what potential looks like at 58. A man who has spent 30 years executing complex custom work for other people's businesses has built enormous amounts of transferable skill and demonstrated work ethic. None of that shows up in a credit score. A credit score is a number derived from a history of financial products. It tells you how someone has handled debt. It tells you almost nothing about what they will build if you give them the chance. In Ontario in 2023, the median age for first-time small business owners in skilled trades was 49. Many of them cited a health event or workplace injury as the catalyst. Most of them said the hardest part was not the work. It was convincing someone in a building on a main street that they were worth the risk. Harold did not know those numbers. He just knew he had a garage, a workbench, a portfolio of 30 years of work, and a daughter who called every Sunday. He sat in the waiting area after the appointment and drank the cup of coffee someone had placed in front of him without explanation. And he thought about the staircase in the photograph, the way the oak had looked before the first coat of finish, raw and honest, the grain running through it like something alive. He thought about Precious, her voice on the phone last Sunday, tired but steady. She had a clinical placement starting in March. She was nervous and she hid it badly, which was something she had gotten from him, and he had never told her that because it seemed like the kind of observation that would embarrass her. He thought about what he would build first if the answer was yes. The dining table for the couple in Dundas, white oak, he was thinking. Breadboard ends. Something that looked like it had always been in the room. The answer came 3 days later. Renata had spent those 3 days reviewing the file twice, consulting with her analyst, calling the contractor reference Harold had listed and speaking to him for 11 minutes instead of the usual 3, and writing and deleting 2 versions of her recommendation before settling on a third. The credit score was 6 on 11. The threshold was 6 on 50. She had override authority in cases of compensating factors. She had used it 4 times in her career. She was about to use it a 5th. Her reasoning was documented, defensible, and real. 30 years of demonstrated trade competency. Client references that exceeded standard requirements. A business plan that showed realistic cost modeling. Preliminary client interest that represented a credible path to early revenue. And a medical history that explained the credit gap without indicating ongoing financial instability. She did not write about the sidewalk. She did not write about -14, or the hour he had stood there without moving, or the hands on the desk, or the question she had asked him, and the answer that had taken him no time at all to give. Those things did not belong in a loan assessment, but they were in the room with everything else she wrote. Present the way cold stays in old walls even after the heat is on. The loan was approved for $13,500, slightly under the requested amount, structured with a 6-month deferred payment period to allow the business to begin generating revenue before repayment began. Harold received the call on a Saturday morning. He was in the garage, running his hand along a piece of salvaged ash he had been holding onto for 2 years, waiting to know what it wanted to be. His phone buzzed on the workbench. He looked at the screen. Pemberton Credit Union. He set down the wood. He answered. He did not speak for 4 full seconds after he heard the words. Then he said, "When does the paperwork need to be signed?" That evening, he called Precious. She picked up on the second ring, same as always. "Hey, Dad, you eat today?" he told her. "Not everything. Just the part that mattered." The loan came through. She went quiet for a moment. Then, "Dad," just the word, just his name, his title, just that one syllable carrying everything she meant by it. "I know, baby," he said. "I told you," she said. "I told you did," he said. "You were right." He could hear her smiling through the phone. It was a specific sound, a small exhale, slightly unsteady, the kind of sound she made when she was trying not to cry and mostly succeeding. He had heard it at her high school graduation. At the airport when she left for Guelph. He had heard it enough times to know exactly what it meant. It meant, "I was so scared this wouldn't work, and I'm so glad it did." He stayed on the phone with her for 40 minutes. She told him about her placement. He told her about the ash wood in the garage. She asked if he was going to make her a bookshelf when he got the shop running properly, and he said that depended on whether she was going to keep her books in alphabetical order or by color. And she said by color, obviously. And he said then no, and she laughed, and he laughed, and then they were just 2 people on the phone in the dark being exactly what they were to each other. The table saw arrived in February. Harold assembled it in the garage over 2 days, reading the manual, checking the alignment, running a test cut on a piece of scrap pine, and then standing back and looking at the result, the way a person looks at something they have waited a long time for and are almost afraid to believe is real. The dining table for the couple in Dundas took him 3 weeks. White oak, breadboard ends, hand-plane top, a finish that took 4 coats and 2 days of drying between each one. He delivered it on a Saturday. The woman opened the door and saw it in the back of his truck and said, "Oh, just that, oh." The way people say things when they've run out of language and sound is the only option left. He set it up in their dining room. He adjusted the leveling feet. He stood back. It looked like it had always been there. He got 3 referrals from that couple in the first month. By April, he had more work than he could take. By June, he was looking into whether the garage could be expanded or whether he needed to think about a small commercial space. He kept a notebook on the workbench where he wrote down project details, wood specs, client notes, dimensions, on the inside cover, in his own handwriting, in the careful print of someone who learned to letter on job sites and never lost the habit. Every piece of wood was once part of something standing. It knows how to hold. Renata Okafor-Wells did not know about the dining table or the 3 referrals or the notebook. She did not know about the conversation with Precious on the Saturday night, or the laugh, or the sound of a daughter trying not to cry. She did not know that Harold had stood in her waiting area and drunk a cup of coffee that she had quietly asked the front desk to bring him, because she had watched him stand in the cold for an hour, and the least she could do was that one small thing. She did not do it for credit. She did not expect to hear anything more about Harold Asante once the file left her desk. She heard from him in September. He sent a letter, handwritten, 2 pages, on plain paper. He thanked her for the loan and for the deferred period, which had given him the room he needed to build the first 3 projects without the pressure of immediate repayment. He told her the business was operating above his first-year projections. He enclosed a photograph. Not the staircase this time. A table. White oak, sitting in someone's dining room with a vase of flowers on it, an afternoon light coming through the window behind it, and the grain of the wood running through the top like something that had always known where it was going. He had written at the bottom, in the same careful print, "This is what $14,000 looks like when it goes to the right place." Renata read the letter twice. She set it on her desk. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting a proposal for the credit union's board. A pilot lending program for skilled tradespeople over 50 in career transition. Modified risk assessment criteria. Weighted heavily toward demonstrated competency, reference quality, and business plan clarity. No credit score minimum, but a structured documentation requirement and a mentorship. Pairing with a local business advisor for the first year. She had been thinking about it. Since January, she had the language now. She called it the Concession Street Program, which told no one anything specific and told the people who needed to know exactly everything. She presented it to the board in October. The vote was 4-2 in favor of a 2-year pilot. The dissenting votes cited risk. The supporting votes cited the same thing she had cited in January. Compensating factors. The program opened applications in November. In its first intake, 17 tradespeople applied. 11 were approved. Among them was a 54-year-old electrician in Stony Creek, whose back had given out the same way Harold's had, for the same reason, doing the same kind of work. Her name was Claudette Arsenault, and she wanted to start an electrical inspection consulting business, and she had a credit score of 623 and references that made Renata's lending advisor describe them, quietly, to Renata as unusually strong. Approved, Renata said. In the small office set aside for the Concession Street program on the ground floor of the credit union, someone had hung a framed photograph near the entrance. A table, white oak, afternoon light, flowers in a vase. Grain running through the top like something that had always been on its way somewhere and finally arrived. Visitors looked at it sometimes and assumed it was decorative. A stock photo, maybe. Something chosen for warmth. It was not a stock photo. But if you didn't know the story, you would never know what it cost to build. Not in materials, in everything else. In 7 hours on a sidewalk in January, in -14, with a file in a waterproof sleeve and hands that had built other people's dreams for 30 years, and were finally ready to start on something of their own. A year after the loan closed, Harold Asante drove past the credit union on Concession Street on his way to deliver a commission in the East End. He did not stop. He had somewhere to be, and he was not late. But he looked at the building as he passed, at the glass doors, at the sidewalk where he had stood through a January morning waiting for someone inside to decide whether he was worth the risk. He thought about what it cost to stand there, the cold in his hands, the wind off the escarpment, the way he had counted reasons to stay and kept arriving at the same answer. Then he drove on. He had a table in the back of his truck. The customer was waiting. The work was not finished yet, and he had never once in his life been the kind of man who left something half done.